It's an honor to be here today with a professor I truly admire, Eiko Siniawer. And what may I call you in this interview?
You can call me Eiko.
Is that okay? Thank
Yeah.
you. My name is Alisa Freedman, and I'm a professor of Japanese literature, cultural studies and gender here at the University of Oregon. And this video is being recorded as part of the Oregon, Vietnam, Japan Exchange and Collaboration Project, which aims to promote Japanese studies and is funded by a generous grant from the Japan Foundation. So today's format, I'd like to briefly introduce Eiko, and then I'd like to launch into just an open discussion between the two of us with some questions prepared in advance. She's the class of 1955 Memorial Professor of History at Williams College. Her first book, Ruffians, Yakuza, and Nationalists, published in English in 2008. Is it being translated into Japanese this year?
It came out this summer, yeah, in Japanese.
How exciting. Congratulations.
Thanks.
This is a wonderful book that explores, and I'm going to quote from her website, ruffianism became embedded and institutionalized in the practice of modern Japanese politics, and argues that for much of Japan's modern history, political violence was so systemic and enduring that Japan can be considered a violent democracy. Eiko's second book, which is a fantastic topic, Waste. This is WASTE, not
Right.
explores the value of waste and what it means to be wasteful, and how shifts in the meanings of waste throughout post-war and late 20th century Japan reflect people's struggles to find value, meaning, and happiness in a post-industrial, capitalist, consumerist, and affluent Japan. Again, I'm quoting from website. This was one of the books that my graduate students have been most requesting to read. And I also admire the range of sources that you use, such interdisciplinary, valuable sources, that this book is an excellent model for anyone who's about to write cultural history and is looking for topics that often go underlooked, but really truly reflect who we are and what we're becoming. In addition, Eiko does an amazing amount of service work, and she's currently serving on the Northeast Asia Council, which is a very time consuming job, but a great service to the fields. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Uh,
It's my pleasure.
May I ask first, I introduced your books, and I know I'm not even doing them justice because they're so rich with ideas, but can you explain a bit more about how you choose your research topics and what you research? You choose things that many people decide not to study.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think both of the books, the two books that you mentioned, are very different. Actually, the first one, Ruffians, Yakuza, Nationalists, is a kind of political history, or maybe history of political culture. And the second book, Waste, is I think more of a kind of socio-cultural history. So they are very different. I think you're right that they share an interest in phenomena that are often overlooked, but if you pay attention to them, are ubiquitous, or phenomena that are somehow, to some people, unseemly somehow. But again, you start to kind of see how they are interwoven and infused into many things. So they share that. In terms of how I choose my topics, they start with just what I happen to be curious about, something that I wonder about. And then I see if anybody else has written about this question that I have. So it's very much a kind of just a personal interest. And then after that point, I start to ask, well, does this topic speak to larger questions? You know, does it illuminate something broader? And also, you know, does it kind of further knowledge in some way? You know, would I be creating knowledge in some way? And so those are the main things. Although the kernel of it is is very personal, just a kind of personal. Oh, I wonder about X. Then I see if it actually, you know, has legs as an intellectual research project.
I also think you're very brave to choose these topics. Like, I'm curious about how do you do research on things that, as you mentioned, well, seem unseemly or people intentionally turned a blind eye to?
Yeah, so I think in some ways that's more of a challenge, or that was more of a challenge for the first book, um, which when I initially started that project, I thought I was going to write a kind of social history of the Yakuza. This was
Wow.
the initial, idea. This is back in the curiosity stage. And then, of course, I soon realized, I probably should have realized earlier, that I wasn't going to have the kind of archival research, the kind of source space that I would want to write that history. This seems rather obvious now in hindsight, but it took me a little bit of time to figure that out. But I was kind of collecting materials along the way of where Yakuza would kind of pop up in politics.
Hmm.
Um, and actually, I'm not in politics. I was kind of collecting wherever they popped up, and then noticed that a lot of those sources were intersecting with politics. And that's how that project kind of morphed into one that was about Yakuza involvement in politics. And then I ran into, though, another challenge where I was finding these other people, groups of people who seemed kind of Yakuza like, but weren't technically Yakuza, like, ruffian types that I didn't know. Did they belong to a Yakuza organization? I don't know. And so that I initially saw as a kind of problem, which was like, oh, I don't know. Do they fit in this project because they're not technically Yakuza? And then I realized, oh, well, they are quite Yakuza-like in the ways in which they use violence and use violence in politics. And that's how that project expanded into thinking about kind of what I call violence specialists, as there's people who are practiced in using violence in the context of politics. Um, so it broadened out into this project that was about violence and politics, and the kind of place of violence specialists of various kinds into politics. Um, so there's a kind of evolution there.
Hmm.
So I don't know. I don't think that's particularly brave necessarily. Um, I I do also, at least, thinking about the Yakuza part of that. The book does end in 1960, so it is kind of solidly historical, even though it has resonances for the present. Um, I don't actually think of tackling topics that are unseemly as requiring courage of any kind. I don't think that even really occurred to me. I mean, in some ways, that is part of what makes me fascinated with the topic. Um, is is to do something that's different. And I think about this in the evolution of the waste project, which that project initially I thought was going to be a history of garbage, so just kind of physical waste. Um, and I thought I was going to. I started in Meiji just because I'm starting in Meiji, and I thought I was going to kind of do a full sweep of the modern period. And with that, I realized if it was just about garbage, I couldn't figure out how to make it different or say something about something that we didn't know that much about. It was becoming to me a project about, especially in the Meiji period, about kind of notions of hygiene and civilization, etc. And I didn't think I could say anything that we didn't already know about the Meiji period. And so that's how then it kind of morphed into a book that was more about the concept of waste than about kind of literal waste. Um, so in some ways, I think just my desire to actually hopefully say or do something different is what kind of drives the development of these projects.
Fascinating. Makes me wonder, what is your next project? What are you working on now?
So I have a couple of projects. The first one is I'm calling it in shorthand my 1973 project. Uh,
Oh,
although it's obviously won't just be about 1973. As a historian, I understand it's not like you can just look at this one year. But as a shorthand, because I'm interested in the early 1970s as a kind of inflection point in thinking about post-war dreams about the good life, about what the good life is, how that's defined. Um, and the early 1970s to me are fascinating in terms of all that was being talked about in terms of anxiety and uncertainty, The word kind of fuan is used widely at this time. 1973, 74 is when you have both the book and film versions of Nihon Chimbotsu, or, Japan Sinks, the various kind of incarnations of anxiety. I'm in the very early stages of this project, to see if I'd be able to tell. But I have written an article that's coming out in the spring about what's called the toilet paper panic of 1973. I have issues with the use of the word panic, but in any case, that's kind of how it's often known. So I've been working on that. And so that's a main project. Somewhat related and really at the very early stages is another, maybe a side project or article on what was known as the piano murder of 1974. It's a man who murdered his downstairs neighbors because they were playing the piano too loudly. I mean, that was what. And so I was interested in kind of questions of sound and noise, but also kind of uh, urban space. And so various things like that. But that is very, very early. So that's all kind of early 1970s. The second project is one that I have recently started. I was approached about writing a book for a more general audience on the history of Tokyo, which I'm doing obviously is a history of kind of Edo Tokyo. Um, Actually, having written some of the early chapters, I'm starting even before in the kind of pre-modern period. So this is a different kind of project. It's more synthetic. I've been reading your work on Tokyo. This has been very, very helpful. And so here, to me, this project is interesting both in kind of how to tell stories about the city and how to write it in a way that will be engaging for a different audience than the one I normally write for. So it's also a kind of fun and challenging way of thinking about kind of narrative and writing history.
You pick such interesting projects, and I like how your scholarly eye, as you mentioned, goes to things that we often don't that we don't look at. Like when we look at the consumer culture, we look at the consumption of objects and the positivity of it, like what it means to own a brand new shiny refrigerator in the 1950s, for example. But I like how your eye goes to what happens to that refrigerator when it's thrown away, or the offshoots of apartment living, the noise, the garbage, the waste, or the violence of that underlies culture. So I'm looking forward to reading the kinds of stories that you tell in your new project, which brings me to two related questions. One, I'd like to hear more, for example, about how you chose time periods, like focusing on, for example, the pivot of 1973, bringing together the phenomenon of Japan Sinks. And I don't know if you've probably heard that Netflix is doing a Japan Sinks 2020.
Yes, it's come out. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I have watched several episodes, but not the entire series. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting interpretation. Or
Yeah.
how the legacy, for example, of a murder that lingers in the popular social cultural imagination. So
Mhm.
one question would be what's the legacy or importance of focusing on a year or a time period? Like why should students, for example, study the 1950s or 1973? And a follow-up question would be, I'm just so curious about what some of your favorite sources when you write this
Mm.
material. So I'm
Mhm.
joining these two questions together just because I'd like to see, because they seem thematically related in your work too.
Yeah, so the issue of kind of time is an interesting one. I mean, my first book dealt with a very long span of time. It's kind of 1860 to 1960. Um, and well, several things, I guess. One of them was that to me, it was kind of important to span the war. So, there's been a lot of more attention recently to this idea of kind of trans-war scholarship, kind of looking at continuities and discontinuities across the war. So that was part of it. Um, but it was also in part because of, I think, the source challenges that I faced with that book, that in some ways I was able to do a longer time period because I didn't have the kind of depth or specificity in some cases that I would have liked. So then I could tell a more kind of more sweeping story, I think, of a century. And then with the second book, I wanted to do a shorter time period, but then of course, and somehow like thinking about the post-war seemed shorter, but then of course I mean, it is shorter than 1860 to 1960, but the post-war is now actually quite long. And because, we haven't yet really thought of the post-war as over. I mean, some people do, and say, there have been various, the Japanese government periodically comes out and says, "Oh, the post-war is over." But I think at least as a kind of scholarly category or way of thinking about time, we haven't moved past the post-war really. Um, and so that actually turned into a long period of time as well. So I think part of what I'm interested in with the 1973 project is thinking about what are the various connections across what are usually thought of as kind of discrete topics or subjects. If we take a year, for example, a year-ish as the kind of unit of time, so that you can look at what's going on in politics and economics and culture and all these things that sometimes get kind of separated out, and
Mhm.
remember that these things were simultaneous. And how does that help us understand a particular period of time? So that is interesting to me. I'm also interested in the early 1970s in Japan as part of thinking about that moment globally as well. There are various things, the oil crisis,
Yeah.
inflation, various things that are global phenomena. So this is also a way for me to think about putting Japan into a more kind of global story, or writing Japan into a global story. So it's not just kind of about chronology, but also I think about geography and space, and kind of globalism or internationalism. Um, yeah,
Yeah, I like that idea of a year as a conceptual framing device or a pivot through which the circulation and confluence of all these other historical forces circulate. So really, when I talk with my students, we talk about how if you're going to look across time periods, it helps to have a very cohesive argument or theme, and you do
right.
that well in your projects. Do you have any advice to anyone who's approaching research in Japanese cultural history or social history?
Any general advice?
Or
Uh,
specific advice? I
right,
think more
right.
toilet paper crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I think my advice is, well, first is to kind of follow the sources, right? To see what you have in front of you. Um, and so, I mean, I think that's, one of the things that I learned from the early iterations of what was originally the Yakuza project, which was I didn't have the sources to write what I had initially had in mind. And also then it's this kind of, you know, in some ways a kind of dialectical process where you're looking at what you have, and then you adjust your questions, and then
Yeah.
that raises new questions, and then you see if you have the sources, you go look for sources for that, maybe you find them or not. And so it to like give your project room to grow and shift. um, I think also I tend, and this is not advice, but this is just how I tend to work, which is to think really capaciously about sources. And this maybe goes back to your earlier question about sources, which is, the kind of work that I do is kind of archival research, but that doesn't necessarily mean I am always sitting in an archive, which is,
Yeah.
I think I define archive rather broadly. So I think some of the most important sources for the waste book are not um, that document that I found in an archive that no one has ever seen. I mean, quite the contrary. It's, advice literature and children's literature and manga and popular magazines and newspapers and such. So to think really broadly about sources and possible sources as well.
Yeah, that's really solid advice to let the text guide your research. And as you mentioned, like I love the idea of starting with an idea of waste. And waste, as you define it, can be a noun and a verb too.
Yeah,
And there's
yeah,
flexibility. Um,
Yeah.
as we're on the topic, to sort of shift a little bit in our discussion for some final questions, in addition to looking at sources, we're now looking at a time where Japanese studies is globalizing in different ways. I mean, we're during the pandemic of the pivotal year of 2020, that maybe that'll be in your range of yearbooks. We go from 1973 toilet paper
Yeah.
crisis to the toilet paper crisis
That,
of 2020. Do you have any advice for colleagues around the world, or how do you think Japanese studies is changing in our era right now?
yeah. I mean, I think Japanese studies has become, or is becoming, or has been becoming more international in the past, I don't, I, past several years, past decade or so. And I'm thinking about becoming international really in the ways that we think about. And so, I'm a historian, so I'm going to think about the field of history, of the ways in which people are defining their topics and how they're conducting their research. So we are certainly far beyond that period of time earlier in the post-war, where a kind of area studies model born of the Cold War, where a lot of scholarship was very much aligned with, in the case of the U.S. interests and framing. So we're well beyond that. But um, what's notable, I think, is a lot of the work, more recent work, for example, on colonialism and empire. And you can't now write about colonialism and empire and just write about, about mainland Japan, right? You need to kind of look at the empire more holistically. And I think the people who are doing the most exciting work there are also, they're doing archival work beyond the metropole and languages other than Japanese and so on. That wasn't the norm or the expectation, several decades ago. So I think that's really exciting. I also think about fields like environmental history, environmental studies, environmental history, which in some ways, and depending on your approach, decenters the nation. And so you think more about space and landscape and phenomena that don't map so neatly onto national borders necessarily. So I think that has become more international over time. Um, and also, I think maybe this is kind of my hope or aspiration for Japanese studies, which is that Japan be part of conversations about scholars of other parts of the world as a kind of comparative case in some ways about all whole host of global phenomena, whether it's about the movement of people and ideas, or democracy and politics, or environment, or socioeconomic inequality. I mean, these are all um, international, transnational topics um, to which studies of Japan can have a lot to contribute, I think.
Well, thank you very much for these really insightful answers and thoughts about research and about the future and the past and the present of the field. Do you have any remaining comments or questions or suggestions? I'm really excited about your projects. I want to read your take.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing, especially about the kind of the 1973 project, as it reminds me, and maybe this is relevant to graduate students, it reminds me that with every project there is that phase where I don't quite know where this is going. um, and so I think the first time I experienced that as a graduate student, that was quite anxiety provoking, in a sense of kind of, what is this going to come together? I don't know where this is going. I don't quite know what I'm doing. But I'm reminded with every book and every project that that is just a phase.
Good
And it's
point.
okay. Maybe this is just me. I don't know.
No,
But it's
no, it's completely understand.
but it's okay to feel lost and feel a little disoriented in the research process. And in fact, that's quite natural. And so, it's a process of kind of refining and honing and redefining your questions as you discover and learn more. Um, and I think also with every project, I'm reminded of, I think this was also a little hard to think about when I was a graduate student, that a lot of the developing of skills and expertise and creation of knowledge is also a kind of lifelong pursuit as well. So, yeah.
That's solid advice, and I admire how you ground yourself in text too.
Yeah, I mean that's the guide. I think. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge, time, and expertise. It's been wonderful talking with you.